It was one of those nights when the wind carried a chill that crept straight into the bones. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after midnight when the world seemed to pause for a breath. A thin blanket of snow covered the ground, turning the small Ohio town into something that looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for what was about to happen. Catherine walked quickly down the empty alley, her arms wrapped around something small and fragile. Her coat was too thin for the cold and her shoes were soaked through, but she didn't care. Her breath came out in short clouds as she looked around nervously, making sure no one saw her. The streetlights flickered above her, giving off a dim yellow glow that made her shadow stretch long across the snow. She could still hear the faint sounds from the hospital a few blocks away, the beeping of machines, the hum of voices, the soft cries of babies who would be going home with their mothers soon, but not hers. Not tonight. The two little girls in her arms were quiet now. They had stopped crying an hour ago, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe because the cold had made them too weak. Catherine looked down at them. Their tiny faces were almost identical, except for one small birthmark on the cheek of the baby on the right. Their skin was a warm, soft brown, so different from hers. Their curly hair peeked out from under the thin hospital blankets. They were beautiful, so beautiful it hurt to look at them. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. She wanted to cry, but she couldn't. Not anymore. She had cried too much already. Catherine had never thought her life would turn out this way. She was only 23, barely managing to take care of herself, working long shifts at a diner and living in a one-bedroom apartment that always smelled of damp carpet and cigarette smoke. When she found out she was pregnant, she told no one. Not her parents, not her friends, not even the man who was the father. He was gone long before she even knew. He hadn't done anything wrong, really. They had met at a community college event. He was kind and funny and had the kind of smile that made her forget her worries. But their worlds were too different. Her family was strict, proud, and very clear about what they thought of people who didn't look like them. Catherine had grown up hearing the kind of words she now hated to remember. When she realized she was carrying his children, fear took over. She had imagined telling her parents, imagined the look on her mother's face, her father's anger, the gossip that would spread through their small town, and when she went to the hospital alone, she had no plan. None at all. She just knew she couldn't go home with them. Now, as she stood in the alley, snow falling softly onto her hair, she tried to believe she was doing the right thing. "Someone will find you," she whispered to the tiny faces peeking out of the blankets. "Someone better than me. Someone who can love you like you deserve." Her voice trembled. The words felt weak, like lies she told herself just to keep breathing. She found an old trash bin behind the hospital next to the loading dock. It was half full of cardboard and plastic. She hesitated. The baby stirred slightly and a soft whimper came from one of them. The sound nearly broke her. She pulled the blanket tighter around them and looked around again. The streets were still empty. The only sound was the wind brushing past the buildings. She reached out, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped one of the babies. Her fingers were numb, but her heart was burning. She placed the small bundle gently on top of the cardboard, tucking them in as best she could. Tears spilled down her cheeks, freezing as soon as they touched the cold air. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment she just stood there. She wanted to pick them back up, run away, and never look back. But her fear was louder than her love. The thought of being shamed, of losing everything, made her feel trapped. So she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. The night swallowed her up as she disappeared down the alley, leaving only the faint sound of her footsteps fading into the wind. Hours passed. The snow fell heavier now, covering everything in white. The twins lay still under the thin blanket, their breaths faint but steady. Somewhere nearby, a man named Earl was pushing a shopping cart filled with bottles and cans. He was used to the cold. He had lived on the streets for years and had seen almost everything the city could throw at him. But that night something felt different. As he passed the alley, he heard a soft sound. At first he thought it was just a cat or maybe the wind whistling through a pipe. But then he heard it again, a small cry, weak but clear. He stopped and turned toward the sound. His old boots crunched in the snow as he moved closer. When he lifted the lid of the trash bin, he froze. Two tiny faces looked up at him, their eyes barely open. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Oh, Lord," he whispered. "What on earth?" He quickly took off his worn-out coat and wrapped it around them. They were so cold, their skin almost blue. He looked around, his heart racing. He knew he had to act fast. Earl may not have had a home, but he still had a heart. Without thinking twice, he picked them up and ran toward the hospital just a few blocks away. His legs burned from the effort, his breath coming in rough gasps, but he didn't stop until he burst through the emergency entrance doors. "Nurse!" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Somebody, help! I found these babies outside." The nurses rushed toward him, their faces filled with shock. Within seconds, the twins were taken from his arms and carried into a warm room filled with lights and machines. The doctors worked quickly, wrapping the babies in warm blankets, checking their vitals, and trying to bring their body temperature back up. Earl stood there, shivering and breathless, watching through the small window as the nurses moved around the tiny infants. He didn't know who they were or where they came from, but in that moment, he felt like he had been meant to find them. Later, as the police took his statement, he told them everything he knew, which wasn't much. "I just heard a sound," he said quietly. "Couldn't just walk away. Nobody should ever be left like that." The police nodded, though their expressions were grim. They started investigating immediately, checking the hospital records, security cameras, anything that could lead them to the mother. But by morning, there were no clear leads. Catherine had slipped away before anyone even noticed she was gone. At the hospital, the twins slowly began to recover. The nurses took turns holding them, feeding them, and talking softly to them. They gave them temporary names, simple ones just so they could be written on their charts. Everyone on the maternity floor knew about them. Some cried quietly when they passed by their crib. Others whispered prayers. "Poor little angels," one nurse said, brushing a finger over one baby's tiny hand. They didn't ask for any of this. Days turned into weeks. News of the abandoned twins spread through the town, appearing briefly on local television and in the papers. People donated clothes, blankets, and formula. A few families even came forward offering to adopt them, but it would take time. The system had rules, and the babies had to stay under state care until everything was sorted. As for Catherine, she watched it all unfold from a distance. She had moved out of town, found a small job in another city, and tried to start over. But no matter what she did, she couldn't stop thinking about that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces. Every time she heard a baby cry, her stomach twisted. She told herself it was for the best, that they were better off without her, that someone kind would find them and give them the life she couldn't. But guilt is a heavy thing, it doesn't fade easily. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, she would imagine what they might look like now. Were they safe? Were they happy? Did they hate her even though they didn't know her? Years would pass before she would know the answers. But for now, all she had were those haunting questions and the memory of that freezing night. Back in the hospital nursery, the twins slept peacefully. The nurses had grown attached to them, always checking on them even when they weren't on duty. There was something special about those babies, something strong in the way they survived when they shouldn't have. Miracle girls, one nurse called them. They were meant to live. And maybe she was right. Because even though their story began in a cold alley behind a hospital, it was only the beginning. The world had tried to throw them away, but fate had other plans. Their tiny hearts kept beating, their lungs kept fighting, and their lives, though fragile, were already part of something much greater than anyone could see at the time. Earl came to visit them once before they were transferred into foster care. He brought 2 small knitted hats he had found from a church donation box. When he placed them gently beside the babies, he smiled, a tear sliding down his weathered cheek. "Y'all be strong now," he whispered. "You're gonna make it. I just know it." And they did. Even though they couldn't understand the words, somehow those 2 tiny souls seemed to hold on to them, because sometimes, even the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of a life. And in this case, they already had. That cold winter night that began with fear, shame, and despair would later be remembered for something else. Hope. The kind that survives the darkest moments. The kind that grows even in the places you least expect. No one could have imagined then that the 2 little girls found in a trash bin would one day grow up to change lives, build empires, and come face to face with the woman who left them behind. But fate has its own way of weaving stories, and theirs was only getting started. The twins didn't remember the night they were found. They didn't remember the cold or the snow or the hands that carried them out of the dark. But somehow, deep in their hearts, they always carried a feeling. The kind that sits quietly inside you, like an echo from a story you were too young to hear. They were given new names when they entered the foster system. From hospital records to court documents, their early life was written in short, dry words. Found abandoned. No known parents. Placed in state custody. Those few lines were the start of a long, hard journey. Their early years were a blur of changing faces and unfamiliar walls. One month they lived with a kind woman who always smelled of soap and cinnamon, and the next month they were with a couple who barely looked at them. Each move came with boxes, confusion, and tears they didn't understand. They were never apart, though. Even when people talked about separating them, the system always decided to keep them together. That was their one constant. The older they got, the more they relied on each other. One twin always knowing what the other felt without needing words. By the time they turned 5, they had lived in 6 different homes. Some were safe, some were cold, and a few were worse than either of those. But through it all, they had each other. They shared a single blanket when the heater didn't work. They whispered stories at night when they were scared. They learned that no matter where they ended up, they would never be truly alone. In school, the twins stood out, not just because they were bright, but because they looked different from most of the kids in the small towns they were placed in. Some children were curious, some were kind, but others could be cruel. There were whispers, jokes, and sometimes even questions they didn't know how to answer. Why don't you look like your foster mom? Where's your real family? Are you sisters for real? They would just smile quietly and nod. Yes, we're sisters, always. Teachers noticed how close they were. When one cried, the other's eyes would water. When one laughed, the other would follow. They shared everything, their food, their clothes, even their dreams. But despite their closeness, the system didn't make it easy for them. They stayed in foster care longer than most children. Families wanted babies, not 2 growing girls who already carried shadows in their eyes. Then one day, when they were 8 years old, everything changed. They had been living in a small foster home run by an older woman who was kind enough but tired. She did her best, but there were too many kids and not enough attention to go around. The twins often sat together in the corner, drawing pictures and whispering plans about what they would do when they finally had a forever home. One afternoon, a couple came to visit. They were quiet, gentle people, a man with warm eyes and a woman whose smile felt like sunlight. They didn't come with loud voices or promises. They just sat down with the twins and talked. Not about adoption, not about the system, but about simple things. Favorite colors, what they liked to eat, what they dreamed of becoming. The twins were shy at first, but slowly they started to open up. They laughed when the man made a silly face. They listened carefully when the woman told a story about planting flowers. Something about them felt safe, the kind of safe the girls had never really known. A few weeks later, the twins were told they would be moving again. Only this time, it wasn't another temporary stay. It was home. Their new parents were kind and patient. They didn't try to change the twins overnight or erase where they came from. They let them take their time. The first few weeks, the girls were quiet. They kept their clothes folded neatly, afraid that if they made a mess, they'd be sent away. They waited for the shouting, the coldness, the sudden goodbye, all the things they had known before. But it never came. Instead, they found warmth. They found routines, breakfast at the kitchen table, bedtime stories, laughter in the living room. They found love in the small things, in the way their new mother brushed their hair, in the way their father waited outside their classroom every day after school. Slowly, the fear began to fade, still questions lingered. Who were they really? Where did they come from? Why had no one ever come looking for them? Their new parents told them what little the state had shared, that they were found near a hospital as babies, that no one had claimed them, and that someone very kind had saved their lives. The twins didn't talk much about it then, but sometimes late at night one of them would whisper to the other, "Do you think she loved us? The one who left us?" The answer never came, but the question stayed with them as they grew. As the years passed, they started to shine in school. They were smart, not just book smart, but thoughtful, curious, and full of ideas. One loved to build things, taking apart old radios and trying to fix them again. The other had a love for numbers and puzzles, always solving problems faster than anyone else. Teachers noticed their potential. One day, a counselor told their adoptive parents, "These girls have something special. They can go far if they're given the right chances." Their parents believed it too. They didn't have much money, but they made sure the twins had what mattered most: encouragement, books, and the belief that they could be anything. Middle school came with new challenges. The twins still faced stares and whispers sometimes. People still asked where they were from. But now they had learned to lift their heads high. They didn't need to explain themselves anymore. They had found strength in each other and in the love they had at home. Sometimes the memory of their early years came back in flashes. The sound of crying, the cold, the feeling of being unwanted. But instead of letting it break them, they used it as fuel. They promised each other that one day they would build a life so good, no one could ever doubt that they were meant to exist. By high school, they were thriving. They joined clubs, volunteered at community events, and studied hard. They weren't the loudest or the most popular, but people respected them. They had a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from surviving something no one else understands. One summer, they decided to volunteer at a children's home. They wanted to give back, to help kids who were going through what they once did. That's when they realized something deeper. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about purpose. They saw their younger selves in those children. The fear, the confusion, the longing for someone to care. It made them even more determined to succeed, not just for themselves, but for others like them. At home, their parents watched them with pride. "You've both come so far," their father said one evening at dinner. "You're proof that love can change everything." The twins smiled, but inside they knew love wasn't the only thing that had kept them going. It was also courage. The courage to keep believing, even when life had given them every reason not to. When college applications began, both girls had big dreams. One wanted to study technology. She loved the idea of creating things that could make life easier for people. The other was drawn to business and finance. She wanted to learn how to build something that could last. They applied for scholarships, wrote essays about resilience and hope, and waited for the letters that would decide their future. The day the first acceptance letter came, their house filled with laughter. It wasn't just about getting into college. It was about proving that they could rise from anything. On their last night before leaving for college, they sat together in their shared room, surrounded by boxes and bags. The moonlight came through the window, soft and silver. "Do you ever think about her?" one asked softly. "The woman who left us?" "Yeah, sometimes," the other replied. "But I think maybe she thought she was doing the right thing. Maybe she couldn't take care of us. Maybe she hoped someone would find us." They sat in silence for a while. Then one said, "I think someone did find us, and maybe that's all that matters." They both smiled at that, and the weight in the room seemed to lift a little. When they arrived at college, they quickly realized how big the world really was. There were people from everywhere, different faces, stories, and dreams. For the first time, they didn't feel like outsiders. They felt like part of something larger. But life wasn't easy. College brought new struggles, money problems, long nights, and the pressure to succeed. There were times they couldn't afford the books they needed. Times when they worked extra shifts at the campus cafe just to pay for meals. But they never gave up. They reminded each other of the nights they had nothing and still made it through. They found mentors who saw their potential. Professors who encouraged them, friends who believed in them. Slowly, they began to dream even bigger, not just about success, but about making a difference. By their third year, they started talking seriously about building something of their own. An idea began to form, a platform that could help kids from low-income families find scholarships and opportunities more easily. They had both struggled to find the right information and wanted to make it simpler for others. It was just an idea at first. Sketches in notebooks, long talks in the dorm room, and coffee-fueled brainstorming sessions. But they had passion, and that was enough to start. When graduation day came, their parents sat in the crowd, tears in their eyes. The twins walked across the stage together, holding hands as their names were called. It was more than a diploma. It was proof that they had turned pain into power. That night, as the sun set and the celebration quieted down, they stood outside the campus, looking at the horizon. "We've come a long way," one said. "Yeah," the other replied softly, "but I feel like our story's just beginning." They didn't know how true that was. Life had more to show them, more success, more challenges, and one day, a truth that would bring everything full circle. But for now, they had hope. They had love. And they had each other. Two sisters who had once been left in the dark but were now walking boldly toward the light. College had taught the twins many things, but the biggest lesson wasn't in a classroom. It was that dreams only matter if you're willing to fight for them. After graduation, the sisters moved into a tiny apartment in the city. It wasn't much, just one bedroom, one small kitchen, and a view of the street below. But to them, it felt like the start of everything. They had freedom, ambition, and a shared dream that kept them awake long into the night. Their idea was simple but powerful. Create a website that connected students from low-income backgrounds to scholarships, internships, and mentors. They had struggled so much to find help during college, digging through countless websites, filling endless forms, often missing deadlines because they didn't have the right information. They didn't want others to go through that same pain. In the beginning, it was just the two of them and an old laptop. They didn't have money for fancy software or offices. They built everything from scratch, learning as they went. One sister focused on designing the platform and learning how to code, while the other handled communication, outreach, and finding partners. They worked from their tiny kitchen table surrounded by coffee cups, sticky notes, and piles of notebooks filled with ideas. Every morning started the same way. They'd wake up early, make instant coffee, and remind each other why they were doing this. For kids like us, one would say. For those who just need someone to believe in them. But dreams don't always come easy. There were months when nothing seemed to work. The website crashed. Their savings ran out. Rent was late more than once. There were nights when they sat in silence wondering if they had made a mistake. Maybe this is too hard, one whispered once, her voice small in the dim light. The other reached across the table, took her hand and said, "We've been through worse. We can't give up now." Those words kept them going. Eventually, they decided to look for investors. That meant meetings, lots of them. Most people didn't take them seriously. They were young, new, and didn't come from big schools or rich families. Some listened politely but said the same thing. "It's a nice idea, but you'll need more experience." Others didn't even bother to reply. Still, they kept trying. Every rejection became motivation to do better. They improved their presentation, added new features to the website, and started sharing success stories from the few students who had already benefited from their platform. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. A small news blog featured their story. The headline read, "Twin Sisters Help Underprivileged Students Find Scholarships Through New Platform." It was a short article, but it spread quickly. Within days, their inbox was flooded with messages from students, parents, and teachers thanking them. People started sharing the story online. Larger media outlets picked it up. Soon their faces were everywhere, on local news, websites, even talk shows. It felt unreal. When a well-known investor reached out to meet them, they could hardly believe it. He had read about their journey and wanted to support their mission. "What you're doing," he said during their first meeting, "isn't just a business. It's a movement." With his investment, everything changed. They hired a small team, rented a real office, and upgraded their platform. The number of students signing up grew from hundreds to thousands. Schools and organizations began partnering with them. For the first time in their lives, they weren't just surviving, they were building something meaningful. Even with success, they never forgot where they came from. They made sure their platform was free for students. They added a mentorship program where professionals could guide teenagers through college applications. They even started visiting schools, giving motivational talks to young people who thought their dreams were too far away. Every time they looked at those students, they saw a reflection of themselves, the same uncertainty, the same longing to belong, the same quiet hope. One afternoon, after finishing a school talk, one of the twins sat quietly in the car. She stared out the window, lost in thought. "What's wrong?" her sister asked. She hesitated. "I keep thinking about the woman who left us. Do you ever wonder what happened to her?" Her sister sighed. "Sometimes, but maybe it's better not to know." "Maybe," she said softly, "but a part of me still wishes I could understand why." It wasn't anger anymore. It was curiosity, an ache that never completely faded. As the years passed, their company grew even bigger. They started winning awards, getting invited to conferences, and working with international organizations. People called them inspirations, role models, and self-made women. But behind the titles, they were still the same sisters who once shared a thin blanket in a foster home and dreamed of something better. They still lived simply, still worked hard, and still sent thank you letters to the people who helped them when they had nothing. They visited their adoptive parents every weekend, helping with chores, cooking dinner, and talking late into the night about how life had changed. One day, while visiting their parents, they got a call from a popular television show. The host wanted to feature their story in a special episode about women changing the world. At first, they hesitated. They weren't used to being in the spotlight. But after some thought, they agreed. The interview was emotional. They talked about their journey, the struggles, the doubt, the moments of near failure. When the host asked about their early childhood, they paused. One of them said softly, "We were abandoned as babies, but someone found us and saved our lives. After that, we were placed in foster care and later adopted by the most wonderful parents anyone could ask for. We don't know who our birth mother was, but if she's still out there, I hope she knows we're okay." There was a silence in the studio. The host wiped a tear and said, "You've turned your pain into something beautiful." The episode aired a week later. Millions watched it. The comments online were full of love and admiration. People shared their own stories of struggle and survival. But in one quiet living room far away from all the attention, an older woman watched the same interview with trembling hands. It was Catherine. She had grown older, her hair now streaked with gray, her hands thinner and slower than before. She lived alone in a small house, spending most of her time reading or tending to her garden. She had carried her secret for decades, never telling anyone about that night. When she saw the twins on TV, her heart nearly stopped. The moment their faces appeared, she knew. Their eyes, their smiles, it was like looking into her past. She turned up the volume, leaning closer to the screen. When one of them said, "We were abandoned as babies," tears filled her eyes. She covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. "My babies," she whispered. "My girls." She listened to every word, every story, every moment of their success. Pride and pain mixed in her heart like waves crashing against each other. She had spent her whole life wondering what had happened to them. She had imagined the worst, that they hadn't survived, that she had ruined everything. But here they were, alive, strong, and shining. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window staring at the stars. For years, she had buried her guilt deep inside, trying to live with it. But seeing them again opened everything she had locked away. The next morning, she made a decision that terrified her. She was going to write to them. She didn't know if they would ever respond. She didn't even know where to send the letter. But she had to try. She found their company's address online and began to write. Her handwriting was shaky, but her words were honest. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote. "I just need you to know that not a day has passed without me thinking of you. I made the worst mistake of my life that night. I was young, scared, and foolish, but I never stopped loving you. When I saw you on television, I finally saw what I always prayed for. You living, thriving, doing good in this world. I'm so proud of you, even if I don't deserve to be." She ended the letter with a simple line. "If you ever wish to see me, I'll be waiting. But if not, I'll still be grateful knowing you're safe." When the twins received the letter weeks later, they didn't know what to think. At first, they thought it was some mistake or maybe even a cruel prank. But as they read the words, something inside them shifted. The handwriting looked aged. The tone was soft, full of regret and love. And the details, too precise to be fake. They sat in silence after finishing it. One of them whispered, "It's her." The other nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "What do we do?" For days they didn't answer. They went about their work, smiling for cameras, attending meetings, but their minds were elsewhere. The letter sat on their table, its folded edges worn from being opened again and again. Their adoptive parents noticed the change. One evening, their mother asked gently, "Is something wrong?" The twins exchanged glances. Finally, one of them said, "We think our birth mother reached out to us." Their parents didn't look angry or hurt. Instead, their father said, "Then maybe it's time you had some answers." It took weeks of thinking, praying, and talking before they made their decision. They wrote back. The letter was short but heartfelt. "We received your message. We've thought about you all our lives. We don't know if we're ready to meet yet, but we want you to know that we're okay. We've had a good life and we forgive you." When Catherine opened that letter, she broke down. She pressed it to her heart and cried like she hadn't in years. Forgiveness was something she never thought she'd receive. And now that she had it, she felt a peace she couldn't describe. The twins didn't know it yet, but that letter would lead to something bigger, a meeting that would change everything. For now, though, they went back to work. Their platform continued to grow. They were invited to global conferences, recognized by governments and featured in magazines. But none of that compared to the quiet healing that had started inside them. They had spent their lives searching for purpose, and now they were beginning to find peace. They didn't realize that life was preparing them for the next chapter, one where forgiveness would not only heal the past but also bring a new beginning, for all three of them. Weeks turned into months after the twins sent that letter. They had written it carefully, each word weighed and reweighed, afraid to say too little or too much. When it was mailed, both sisters sat quietly by the window that night, unsure whether they felt peace or fear. Life continued around them, meetings, interviews, events, laughter, but part of their hearts stayed somewhere between past and present. They didn't know if she would reply. They didn't even know if she was still alive. But deep down, both hoped she would. Then, one afternoon, while they were working in their office, a small envelope arrived. It was plain and soft at the edges with handwriting that looked familiar, the same shaky letters from the first letter. Their assistant placed it on the table and left without a word. The sisters stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a short note. "Thank you for your forgiveness. It is more than I deserve. If you ever wish to meet, I will be here. No pressure, no expectations. Only love." At the bottom was an address, a small town not far from where they had grown up. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. The world seemed to slow down. One of them whispered, "She's not far." The other nodded. "Do you want to see her?" "I don't know," she said, "but I think we need to." That night they sat together at home, their dinner untouched. They talked for hours, about everything, their childhood, their pain, their adoptive parents, their fears. "I thought if I ever saw her I'd be angry," one said. "But now I just feel sad." "I know," the other replied softly. "Maybe it's time to let the sadness go." The decision didn't come easy. They spent days thinking about it, replaying what they might say, what they might feel. Their parents supported them. "You both have the right to know where you came from," their mother told them gently. "No matter what happens, you'll still have a home here." Finally, one crisp Saturday morning, they drove out of the city. The road wound through quiet countryside, lined with trees that swayed softly in the breeze. The air smelled of earth and rain. Neither of them spoke much. They were nervous, excited, scared, and unsure all at once. When they reached the town, it felt almost frozen in time. Small shops, old houses, children playing near fences. They followed the address until they stopped in front of a little white house with faded shutters and flowers in the yard. "This is it," one whispered. For a few moments they just sat there, hearts pounding. Then finally they stepped out of the car. The walk to the front door felt like the longest walk of their lives. Each step carried memories, questions, and emotions they had tried to bury for years. When they knocked, there was a pause. Then the door opened slowly. An older woman stood there, thin, fragile-looking, her hair silver and tied back neatly. Her eyes widened the moment she saw them. She didn't speak. Her hand trembled slightly as it gripped the doorframe. The sisters stood frozen too. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then one of them spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Are you Catherine?" The woman nodded, tears already welling in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "You're my girls, that was all it took." All the walls they had built over the years, the questions, the hurt, the confusion, crumbled in that single moment. Catherine stepped forward slowly, unsure if she was allowed to touch them. "Can I?" she began, but the words broke in her throat. One of the sisters nodded. Catherine reached out and took their hands, her own trembling. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled freely down her face. "I've dreamed of this moment every day," she said softly. "I never thought it would come." Inside the small living room, everything was simple. A few old photos, a worn couch, the faint smell of lavender. The sisters sat across from her, still quiet, still trying to make sense of everything. "I don't even know where to begin," Catherine said, voice shaking. "There's no excuse for what I did. I was scared and I let fear control me. I was young and alone and thought I had no choice. But I was wrong. I live with that mistake every single day." She looked down at her hands. "I've tried to be a good person since then. I've helped others, volunteered, prayed for forgiveness. But it never felt enough. Seeing you both on television, it was like God gave me one last chance to tell you I'm sorry." One of the twins reached out slowly. "We've spent our lives wondering why," she said softly. "We wanted to hate you, but we couldn't. I think we always just wanted to understand." Catherine wiped her tears and nodded. "You deserved so much better. I've never forgiven myself." The room fell quiet again. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like something old finally beginning to heal. After a while, they talked more. Catherine told them about her life, how she left town after that night, how she tried to start over, how the guilt never left her. She showed them photos of herself when she was young, pictures from her nursing days, letters she had written but never sent. The twins listened, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling faintly. They could see the pain in her, but they also saw sincerity. When it was time to leave, they stood up slowly. Catherine followed them to the door. "I don't know if I deserve another meeting," she said softly, "but if you ever want to come back, my door is open." One of the sisters hugged her. "We'll come back," she whispered. "We're not running anymore." As they drove away, neither spoke for a long time. The air in the car felt lighter somehow. Finally, one said, "I thought I'd feel angry, but instead I feel calm." "Me too," the other replied. "I think forgiving her set us free." They started visiting Catherine every few weeks after that. Sometimes they'd bring groceries, sometimes just company. They would sit with her on the porch drinking tea and talking about small things, life, work, flowers, weather. Slowly, what began as cautious meetings turned into something warm and real. Catherine began to laugh again. She told stories from her youth, some funny, some sad. The twins learned more about their father, how he was kind, how he never knew she had been pregnant, how things had simply fallen apart before they could become something. The sisters didn't judge her. They understood that life wasn't always black and white. Sometimes people made terrible choices, not because they were bad, but because they were broken. Over time, the bond between them deepened. Catherine's health, though, was starting to fade. The twins noticed how she grew tired easily, how her hands shook when she tried to pour tea. One day, after a checkup, she told them quietly, "I've been diagnosed with heart problems. The doctors say it's not good." They sat with her in silence. One of them reached out, holding her hand. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "We'll take care of you." From then on, they made sure she never felt forgotten. They hired a nurse to visit her when they were busy. They took her to the hospital for checkups. They even moved her into a better home near the city so she could be closer to them. Catherine often cried when she looked at them. "You've given me more kindness than I ever deserved," she said once. One of the sisters smiled softly. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Months passed like this, filled with quiet moments of healing. The twins still managed their growing company, but they never missed their visits. Sometimes they'd bring her flowers. Sometimes they'd just sit and watch the sunset together. No words needed. During one of those evenings, Catherine said, "Do you know what I see when I look at you two? Hope. You're proof that even when life begins in pain, it can still grow into something beautiful." The twins both smiled, their eyes glistening. "You gave us life," one said. "We gave it meaning together." It was a gentle peace, the kind that comes after years of storms. For Catherine, it was the first time she felt light again. For the twins, it was the final piece of their story falling into place. When she passed away quietly a few months later, they were with her. She was holding their hands. Her last words were simple: "Thank you for coming back." The funeral was small, attended by neighbors, nurses, and a few friends she had made later in life. The twins stood together side by side as the sun dipped low in the sky. They didn't see the day as an ending, but as a promise kept, a circle completed. Afterward, they decided to honor her in their own way. They started a foundation in her name, one that offered help to struggling single mothers, safe homes, education, and support. They wanted no woman to feel as desperate or alone as Catherine once had. When the foundation launched, reporters asked them what inspired it. One of the twins said softly, "Because everyone deserves a second chance." The story touched hearts everywhere. Donations poured in. Letters came from women thanking them for giving hope where there had been none. Life moved forward, but they carried their mother's memory gently with them. Her mistakes didn't define her anymore. Forgiveness had rewritten her story, and theirs too. Sometimes late at night, they would still talk about her, I used to think our past was something we should hide, one said. But maybe it's what made us who we are, the other replied. Pain turned into purpose, and in that there was peace. The air was calm the morning after the funeral. The sky was painted with shades of pale gold, the kind that carries both sorrow and peace at the same time. The sisters sat together in their mother's garden, surrounded by the flowers she had planted months earlier. Even though she was gone, the place still felt full of her presence, gentle, quiet, and forgiving. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind through the leaves and the distant chirping of birds filled the silence between them. One of them finally said softly, "She waited her whole life for peace. I'm glad she found it before the end." The other nodded. "She did. And I think she helped us find it too." They had both grown in ways they never expected. Forgiving their mother had changed something deep inside them. It was as if the heavy weight they had carried since childhood had finally lifted. They could breathe freely now, not as abandoned children, but as women who had turned pain into strength. After that morning, they both agreed that their mother's story should not disappear quietly. She had made terrible mistakes, but she had also spent her last years trying to make amends. That mattered. They wanted the world to see that even broken stories could still end with grace. So they decided to honor her memory properly. Their company had already become famous for helping students from poor families. But now they wanted to do something more personal, something inspired by her life. They came up with an idea to create a new project, a foundation that would help young mothers who felt lost and hopeless. It would give them a safe place, education, and guidance to rebuild their lives. They named it the Second Light Foundation. When the project launched, it immediately caught attention. Reporters wrote articles, people shared it online, and many came forward to donate. The sisters stood on stage during the opening ceremony, surrounded by volunteers and families who had been touched by their story. One of them spoke gently into the microphone. "We all make mistakes," she said. "Sometimes they break us. But if we have the courage to forgive others and ourselves, we can turn even our darkest moments into something that shines." The audience clapped softly, but many were wiping tears after the event. A young woman with a small baby came up to them. She said quietly, "I was about to give up before I heard your story. I'm not alone anymore because of what you started." That moment made everything worth it. The sisters smiled, and one of them hugged the woman gently. "You're not alone," she said. "You never were." Over the next few years, the foundation grew beyond anything they imagined. They opened centers in different cities. They offered scholarships, counseling, job training, and housing for struggling mothers. Each time they visited a new center, they saw faces full of hope. Women who were trying again, believing again. It was as if their mother's forgiveness had spread, touching people she would never meet. But despite their success, the sisters remained humble. They still lived simply, worked hard, and always remembered where they came from. Their story became a symbol of resilience. People admired how they had risen from pain, but the twins never let fame change them. They always said, "We just did what we had to do." One quiet afternoon, several years later, they visited their mother's grave together. The sun was setting and the air was warm. They placed a small bouquet of white lilies on the stone, just as they always did. The headstone was simple, no grand words, no fancy carvings. It only said Catherine Miller, loved, forgiven, and free. They stood there in silence, remembering everything that had happened. The night they were found, their childhood struggles, their success, the moment they met her again, and the peace that followed. One of them whispered, "She would be proud, don't you think?" The other smiled softly. She already was. They stayed there until the sky turned deep blue, then walked away slowly, hand in hand. Time moved on. Years passed, and the world continued to change. Their company expanded internationally. Their foundation touched thousands of lives, and their names became symbols of hope and compassion. But they never forgot the beginning, the story that had shaped them. Whenever they were invited to speak at schools or conferences, they didn't talk about wealth or success. Instead, they talked about forgiveness. Forgiveness, one of them said once on stage, isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about freeing yourself from it. We can't change the past, but we can choose what kind of future we build from it. People listened in silence, moved by the simplicity of their message. Many came to them afterward, sharing their own stories, about parents they hadn't spoken to, about guilt they couldn't let go of, about wounds that still hurt. And every time the twins said the same thing: start by forgiving yourself. Everything else will follow. Their compassion drew people together. They created community programs, wrote a book about their journey, and even produced a short film about the foundation. The film ended with a simple line: they were thrown away once, but they chose to return, not with anger, but with love. It became one of the most shared videos online that year. People wrote comments saying it made them cry, made them call their families, made them want to heal. The twins never expected such a reaction. They had only wanted to tell the truth, a truth that love could survive even the deepest wounds. One day they visited the old neighborhood where they had grown up. It had changed, new buildings, new faces, but some corners still looked the same. They walked past the park where they used to play as kids, the school they had attended, and even the foster home that had once been their refuge. Standing there, one of them said quietly, "It's strange. Everything looks smaller now." The other smiled. "Maybe we just grew." They laughed softly, their eyes glistening. It wasn't sadness anymore, it was gratitude. Every tear, every hardship, every lonely night had led them here. As they stood there, a young girl came up and asked shyly, "Are you the twin sisters who help people?" They nodded with warm smiles. "My mom told me your story," the girl said. "She said it means even when people hurt you, you can still be kind." The twins looked at each other. That one sentence was enough to remind them why they had kept going all these years. They knelt to the girl's level and said softly, "Your mom is right. Being kind doesn't mean forgetting. It means being strong enough to love anyway." The girl grinned and ran back to her mother. As they watched her go, the sisters knew the story had already moved beyond them. It belonged to everyone now, to anyone who had ever been lost, broken, or searching for forgiveness. That evening, they returned home. The sky was glowing orange and pink. From their balcony, they could see the city lights twinkling like stars. "Do you ever think about that night?" one asked quietly. "Sometimes," the other replied, "but not with pain anymore. Now I think of it as where everything began." They looked out over the skyline, feeling the cool breeze. The world below them was busy and alive, full of people chasing dreams, fixing mistakes, trying again. "Do you think she can see us?" "Yes," the other said with a gentle smile. "I think she's proud." They stood there a little longer, then went inside, where pictures of their foundation's families filled the walls, mothers smiling with their children, new beginnings in every frame. Each picture told a story on survival, of forgiveness, of hope. And in each one, a little piece of their mother's spirit lived on. Years later, when the sisters were older and ready to slow down, they passed the foundation to a new generation of young women who had once been helped by it. They said during the handover ceremony, "This was never about us. It's about continuing kindness." The crowd applauded. Many of the women who had been rescued through the program were there, successful, happy, and grateful. Some cried as they hugged the twins, thanking them for changing their lives. After the ceremony, the sisters went for a quiet walk together. The evening light stretched long shadows across the street. "We started with nothing," one said softly. "And now look at all this," the other smiled. "It's not ours. It's everyone's. And that's the beauty of it." They reached the edge of a small hill overlooking the city. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from nearby, families, children, the sound of life continuing. They both knew that someday their story would fade into history. But the lessons would remain: forgiveness, compassion, second chances. That was their true legacy. When they returned home, one of them opened an old wooden box. Inside were letters, all the ones their mother had written before she passed. They read through them slowly, smiling through tears. In one of the letters, their mother had written, "If you ever feel lost, look for the light inside you. That's where love never dies." They closed the box gently and looked at each other. "She was right," one said softly. "She was," the other agreed. "And she left that light with us." They turned off the lights, letting the moon fill the room. The city shimmered outside their window, a quiet reminder of how far they had come. They had been abandoned, forgotten, and doubted. But they chose love over hate, forgiveness over anger, and healing over pain. And in doing so, they didn't just change their own lives, they changed countless others. The story that began in the dark ended in the light, and even though their mother was gone, her voice seemed to whisper through every heart they touched. You were never meant to be thrown away. You were meant to shine.